Domain 7, Westward Expansion, Lesson 8, Working on the Transcontinental Railroad. The locomotive is the machine at the front of a train that pulls all the other cars along the track. Before the locomotive was invented, several horses pulled a car or wagon along the rails, but the locomotive had the power of many horses in a single machine. That's why some people gave it the nickname Iron Horse, because the locomotive was made of a type of metal called iron, and it had the power of many horses to pull train cars. How did the locomotive work? Well, at the heart of the locomotive was the steam engine. The locomotive's steam engine was similar to the steam engine used in Fulton's steamboat. A coal or wood-burning furnace produced steam, which powered the locomotive. Remember Casey Jones? Casey Jones drove a locomotive, and his partner, Sim Webb, kept the steam engines burning. Working on the Transcontinental Railroad. My name is Michael, and this is a photograph of my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Ling Wei. He helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad. That's a pretty long word, but it's easy to understand if you split it into two parts. The first part of the word is trans, which means across, and the second part of the word is continental. So my ancestor Ling Wei helped build a part of the railroad that goes across the continental United States, or from the East Coast to the West Coast. Ling Wei began working on the railroad in 1863. By that time, there were many railroads in the United States, but they mostly went from the northeast to the southeast, or from eastern cities like Baltimore to cities in the Midwest like Omaha, Nebraska. It was cheaper, more comfortable, and more convenient for people to travel by rail than to travel by canal or wagon. It was faster, too. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, people could only travel to the west by wagon or horse, or by boat on a river or a canal, and that was slow going. Because the iron horse was faster, cheaper, and more comfortable, and more convenient, many people thought it would be a great idea to have a railroad track that spanned the entire United States. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Ling Wei, helped to lay those tracks that connected settlers in the Midwest near the Missouri River to settlers in Sacramento, California, all the way to the West Coast. How many people can say that about one of their ancestors? It took two separate rail companies to build the Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad Company started building from Omaha, Nebraska, and laid its tracks going west. The Central Pacific Railroad Company started building from San Francisco, California, and laid its tracks going east. At first the two companies were competing against each other to see who could lay the most track. The U.S. government paid each company for every mile of track it laid, and both companies wanted to make lots of money. In the end, the government told them they had to work together and join their tracks. Most of the laborers who laid the track for the Union Pacific Railroad were Irish immigrants. My ancestor Ling Wei worked for the Central Pacific Railroad. Like many other Chinese immigrants during the 1800s, Ling Wei had settled in California. He and other Chinese immigrants, as well as other immigrants from all over the world, came to the United States because of the promise of gold and a better life. When people realized that the mountains of gold they had heard about were a myth, they had to find some other way to survive. So many Chinese immigrants worked on the western portion of the railroad, while the Irish immigrants worked on the eastern section. These workers laid tracks through the mountains, across rivers, and deserts in the United States. The Transcontinental Railroad took 6 years to build, and my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Ling Wei kept journals for all of those years. Here's my favorite journal entry. May 10, 1869. Promontory Point, Utah. Only 100 feet left to lay. That's what I thought of first thing this morning. After several years of hard work, long hours, and little wages, 100 feet of track is all there is left to lay to complete the Transcontinental Railroad today. Now it is hard to believe that the work is complete. Despite the hardship I endured, I feel proud of my work. I think everyone today wanted to share in that sentiment. Wherever I looked, people tried to lend a hand in finishing the track. Men that were just passing through Utah to deliver goods stopped to throw dirt on the ties, or to drive a spike into the ground. Even the presidents of the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad took turns driving the last spike into the rails. It was a spike made of gold to mark the special occasion. They both missed on their first try, and all of us workers laughed. It's not as easy as we made it look. In fact, it is very difficult. Day in and day out we swung those heavy hammers, driving the sharp spikes that held the wooden ties together into the solid ground. We carried heavy wooden ties in the hottest weather you can imagine. The worst days by far were those spent drilling tunnels in the Sierra Nevada mountains. These tunnels had to be big enough for locomotive trains to pass through. First the stone had to be blasted with dynamite, and then we went in and worked on shaping the tunnel. No matter how hard we worked to cut the stone, we would only move a few inches a day. I can still remember how tired my arms felt at the end of those days. It seemed like there was no end in sight, and we'd never reach the other side of the mountains. Other days were filled with worry as we worked through land where Indian tribes were still powerful. They did not like us building through land that had been their homes for many hundreds of years. I do not know how the railroad will change life for them. For settlers and their families on the West Coast, I think the Transcontinental Railroad will change lives a great deal. Trains will provide faster and cheaper methods of transportation for goods and foodstuffs. People on the East Coast will now be able to get goods from the West, and people in the West can now get goods from the East more easily. Travel for people who can afford the train will become more comfortable and convenient too. Of course, many people who cannot afford train tickets will still have to use their wagons for travel. As for us workers, we felt as much excitement as we did fatigue. We set the record for laying the most miles of track in one day. On that day, we worked from sunrise to sunset and laid 10 miles of track. Today, we've finally finished our work. We've built a railroad that connects the east and west coasts of the United States. One day, people will talk about all of the businessmen who dreamed of this and started the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad companies. I hope they talk about my fellow workers and me, too, the men who built the railroad.